Thanks, Michael. As he said, my name is Emily Chamlee-Wright, and I'm the president of the Institute for Humane Studies. And absolutely, it is indeed my pleasure to introduce Yascha Mounk, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, where he holds appointments in the School of Advanced International Studies and the SNF Agora Institute. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a contributing editor to The Atlantic, and he is the founder of Persuasion, an online magazine that is emerging and building a community of thought leaders around the challenges within and the advancement of the project of a liberal democracy. And he is the author of 4 books, the most recent of which is The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. Yascha, welcome. It is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you, Emily.
Well, I love the book. I love what you're doing at Persuasion too. So perhaps later on we can talk a little bit about that as well. But first, The Great Experiment. When you describe the Great Experiment, you're describing an ambitious project, perhaps the most ambitious thing human society has ever done, which is the advancement and sustaining of a diverse liberal democracy. And that language, that modifier diverse, is important here because you make the distinction that it's not just the project on liberal democracy, as if that wasn't ambitious enough. It's the Great Experiment is about diverse and pluralistic liberal democracies. So I'd love to hear you think out loud about that distinction, why that modifier diverse is so important, and then also why it is such an urgent conversation to have, why it's drawing your attention, and what's at stake.
Yeah, as you were asking this question, I was thinking to myself, perhaps I should have called the book The Second Great Experiment. For that, it does not make for a very appealing title. But, in a way, of course, liberal democracies are themselves the great experiment of the modern era. And certainly when the framers founded the United States, it was in some ways a foolhardy undertaking. If you look back at the history of the world in the late 18th century, you did see some very impressive attempts at self-government, but all of them failed in a miserable way. And so they found themselves in a situation in which they decided this was the only way forward, and they had to build new institutions that deal with this challenge. But there wasn't, and this is the way in which I mean experiment, of course, there wasn't a very clear precedent. There wasn't a very clear set of rules. There wasn't a blueprint for how to do that. So they had to invent the kind of society that could actually sustain democracy in the modern era across a huge continent in a way that would deal with the flaws like the factionalism that had brought so many past attempts at self-government to failure. And so I think what we're doing today is a second kind of great experiment, because while we have some of the basic rules and norms and principles that can sustain liberal democracies, not always easily, as we're finding in our own country over the last years, we don't really have much experience with deeply ethnically or religiously diverse democracies that actually treat all of their members as equals, or attempt in a serious way to treat all of their members as equals. So, in Germany, where I grew up, I don't think it's a coincidence that German democracy became stable after World War II, when the society had become, because of the Holocaust and the terrible crimes of the first half of the 20th century, more ethnically and religiously homogeneous than it had done in much of its history. And many democracies like Germany are built on that kind of homogeneity, have become much more diverse in the last decades because of immigration and so on, and now have to figure out how to deal with that new diversity. The United States, of course, has been diverse since its beginning, has been diverse since the founding in the late 18th century. But while American society has been diverse, American politics is not. Just to say that obviously there was extreme rights and privileges accorded to one group with various gradations of exclusion down to the most extreme form of chattel slavery, which gave an easy quote-unquote solution to the problem of how to build a diverse democracy, which is to say you give all the rights and power to one group, and then you don't really have to deal with the challenges that come from ethnic and religious diversity in which people are included in the government. And so this, I think, is what we're trying to do now, whether it's in Germany or the United States or Australia or India or so many other parts of the world, to build deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies that treat the members as equals at a time when there's not much precedent for how to do that.
So I want to think about the tension between, have you talk a little bit about the tension between democracy and diversity at a granular level here? Because if we think about democracy, stripped of its sort of like romantic elements, right? But democracy, if we think about what the internal driving force of democracy itself is, it's to pull in the direction of majority rule. Maybe you would describe that differently, but so if that is the sort of motivation or the motivating force of democracy is to pull toward majority rule, tolerance and excitement for diversity kind of tugs against that, right? So if my group expands in its membership and yours does not, that means in a democratic environment, that means that my group potentially is going to have more power. That's maybe good for me, but it's a threat to you. And so this is a very basic question. And I have to say, I don't know how you're going to answer it, is when we think about liberal democracies, and that's mostly what people mean when they say, I'm a fan of democracy. What they mostly mean, unless they're Viktor Orban or something like that, what they mostly mean is liberal democracy, right? And so doesn't the liberal part of the liberal democratic project protect minority rights? Doesn't the liberal part of that ingredient of the recipe create the conditions for a workable diversity and a workable pluralism? So, that's my basic question is, why do we need the modifier diverse liberal democracies if we've already got the liberal part of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot in there. Let me try and move through it. So the first part is, so why is this hard in the first place, right? Why should we worry about our ability to build ethnically and religiously diverse democracies? And I have sort of three reasons that I emphasize for that in the book. So the first is simply that human beings are, as Jonathan Haidt would put it, deeply groupish, right? So we have a deep tendency towards building groups, treating members of those groups sometimes with incredible courage and altruism, risking our lives to protect other members of our own groups in many historical circumstances. But also this can lead us towards extreme forms of discrimination against the outgroup. And the tendency towards this kind of groupishness is universal. It is inspired very, very easily. So I tell in the book the story of Henry Teifel, who tried to figure out, reflecting on World War II and other calamities of human history, what it is about groups that makes them so powerful, what makes them so capable of inspiring those forms of injustice. And he said, hey, I have an idea for how to study this as a good social scientist. I'm going to create a group that is so silly, so devoid of meaning, so arbitrary, that its members are not going to discriminate against outsiders. And then I'll slowly ladle on features, and that'll allow me to see at what point does this group take on this kind of power. So he got a bunch of kids into the lab in Bristol in England, and he showed them a sheet of paper with a bunch of dots on it. And he said, how many dots on a sheet of paper? And so some kids said 125 and some said 175. He said, great, I'll divide you into a group of overestimators and underestimators and have you play a game against each other. And he expected that, they wouldn't allocate points to each other on the basis of which silly group they're part of. But that turned out to be wrong. As soon as he associated the word underestimator with group and told you you're part of it, the underestimators started to discriminate against the overestimators. And I've experienced a version of that. I teach at Johns Hopkins, which is an incredibly diverse campus now. And my students think of themselves as some of the most tolerant people in the world. And in some ways, perhaps they are, and others, perhaps they're not. But when I have them debate whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich for 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to have them play a little game. The people who think that a hot dog is a sandwich start to discriminate against the people who think that a hot dog is not a sandwich, right? So this tendency towards forming groups and discriminating against anybody who's not a part of it is deeply universal. And that's one of the just fundamental facts that we have to deal with in building these diverse democracies. Now, there's two additional difficulties. One additional difficulty is that most of the time in human history, Political fights have not been among, people who think that a hot dog is a sandwich, sandwichists or something, and not, and anti-sandwichists. And they haven't been, underestimators or overestimators. They've tended, if you look at the worst crimes in human history, to pit members of one religion against those of another, members of one ethnicity against those of another, members of one linguistic or national group against those of another. Those are the kinds of categories of identity which have historically just been especially powerful. And so that makes it harder to deal with a country in which you not only have great ideological diversity, but also great ethnic and religious diversity. I mean, the third point, or the second aggravating difficulty of this groupish human nature is the one that you just talked about with democracy, right? So I'm a great lover of democracy and great believer in democracy, and it would be tempting to think, well, democracy is the answer. But it struck me as I was reading about the history of diverse societies, how many of the ones that actually work quite well were in monarchies or in empires, from Baghdad in the 9th century to Vienna in the 19th century. That's in part because if you didn't have any power and I didn't have any power, we both have to trust the monarch. And so if you have more kids or there's more immigrants who look like you rather than me, doesn't really change my political situation. A democracy is always also a search for majorities. And so if you have more kids than me, or there's, your demographic group is growing more quickly than mine is, then it's very natural for me to start worrying. I think, hang on a second, I used to be in the majority. Perhaps tomorrow I'll be in a minority. But how will that change the amount of political power and influence that I have? Now, in that sense, democratic institutions actually exacerbate the problem of diverse democracies. But you are also right, but rightly understood, liberal democracy can be part of a solution. And I have a whole chapter that tries to lay that out. The problem is, I don't think it's trivial, right? Because for two reasons. First, I think that there is, and I know that I can get a little bit more geeky with this audience. So
absolutely.
Some of the details
Geek
here.
Away.
At the risk of talking for too long. But I think there's two interpretations of how to deal with a relationship between the state and the group and the individual that sort of go wrong and argue against them. So one, which I assume many people here will agree with, is a rejection of what in the 90s used to be called communitarianism, right? So a philosophical tradition which says, look, to deal with all of this religious and ethnic and social diversity in our societies, what we should really do is to make the group a fundamental unit of analysis in our society, and perhaps even to give people rights and duties depending on the kind of group they are part of. So the laws governing marriage and divorce and education and so on that you're subject to may depend on which religious group you're part of, for example, as it does in Lebanon. So that's one kind of answer to how to deal with this. I think there's another answer which perhaps people on this call will be more attracted to, which is a perfectionist liberal answer, which essentially says that we should really think of individuals as the basis of society in a way which encourages them to be autonomous, in a way which says that in a good liberal society, people are not going to be deeply shaped by the kinship networks, deeply shaped by membership in groups, deeply shaped by the kind of religious worship they engage in or the ethnic obligations they feel they might have. So it's a form of liberalism which equates the philosophical principles governing our society with a kind of liberal individualistic vision of what the good life is. And that's something that I do think has a lot of power, even in political philosophy, even in our discourse. And so what I try to do in the book is to give a full-throatedly liberal answer, which can give a real response to the communitarian worries about the hyper-individualism of 21st century America, broadly speaking, or other societies, right? And the way to do that is to recognize that you have to have a double freedom. So in order for us to be free, we need to be free from forms of persecution that come from outside our own group. So that can be political, right? I need to be able to protest the government without being thrown in jail. It can be religious and cultural. I need to be able to engage in form of religious worship with which the majority strongly disagrees without having my house of worship burned down or fearing that a mob is going to try and turn up at my door, or lynch me, or do whatever else, as we're seeing in India and other places around the world at the moment, right? But we also need a second kind of freedom from what Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson call the cage of norms, a freedom from the ways in which our own parents, our own aunties and uncles, our own priests and rabbis and imams might seek to tell us how we should live. And so, and that's something that communitarians cannot do, right? If you start your analysis by saying your rights and duties are determined by your membership in a particular kind of group, then it's difficult to explain why the state sometimes has a duty to actually step in and protect you from the coercive influence of your own group when you choose that you want to live differently from how your parents want you to live, right? And so what you end up with is an account which recognizes that most people will have deep ties of kinship and religious belief to pre-existing groups. That this is one of the things we deeply have to respect in a liberal society. That indeed, that explains the nature of our fundamental individual rights. Why do we care so much about the freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of worship? Because those are tied to those fundamental questions of conscience that are so important to humans, including the ability to remain a member of a group into which you were born. But our respect for groups always has to be contingent on them not being tyrannical, on them not coercing the members to remain a part of it, on citizens in our societies ultimately counting as individuals, and even for many people will not make the choice, because most people will not make the choice, being able to leave the groups into which they were born if they choose to do that.
So I want to go back to the very start of what you've just laid out for us, and it's deep and it's rich, and there's several things I want to get at here and tug at a little bit. One is your laying out of our inherent, hardwired groupish tendencies, the Henri Teifel research that says, like for ridiculous reasons, people will align themselves with one group or another, and there's a natural pessimism that we might be drawn to with that line of thinking, right? It's like well, we're just inherently going to be hardwired toward bigotry and intolerance, right? There's another more hopeful version of that, right? But it takes sort of two steps. One is that the same things that align us to groups, even if they're somewhat silly and arbitrary, is the thing that allowed the human species to be the cooperating species, right? Like we were, our primitive ancestors were incredibly vulnerable. We would have all been picked off by lions had we not been able to figure out how to do teamwork. How to those groupish tendencies were the thing that allowed us to survive, even though we had no claws or sharp teeth, et cetera. So the groupish tendencies, while having very much a dark side, also have that positive side. That's where our art of association, for example, comes from. It allows us to engage to cooperate with people far flung from us who we don't even know in a market society, et cetera. So that ability to cooperate and see a team, even in the silliest of circumstances, is a positive thing as well, right? And so, but the challenge you've laid out is that when that sort of orientation towards tribalism creates conditions for fear, for demonization, the assumption that my team can only win if I annihilate the other, like that's what we don't want. So we want the good parts of our groupish tendencies, but we don't want the bad parts. What allows us to be, a genuine, get the benefits of the meaning-rich environments of family, community, our associational life? How do we get the good stuff without that anxious fear of them? That some other group is out to get us. Well, it seems to me that liberal institutions are the answer there.
Yeah, I think they're a big part of the answer, and obviously the vision that I put forward in the book is a liberal one. I think we need something beyond just the fundamental liberal rights and obligations in order to describe the overall vision of a society where that works, right? So I think you could have, certainly having a basic set of liberal institutions really helps do that, right? Because it helps tell you, look, you feel very strongly about your religion. Perhaps you feel very strongly that it's very important for everybody else to have your religion too. But we live in a society in which if you try to impose the religion on other people, you're going to be punished. But other people who try to impose theirs on you are going to be punished too. And, unless you're in a very clear majority, perhaps you should accept that the best deal you can get is to be free to do what you want, free to proselytize, but not free to coerce other people. And in most circumstances, that has been enough to persuade people. It's not always enough to persuade people, right? In some circumstances, say, no, I'm willing to roll the dice. Let me play for total social domination and victory because I prefer that, or I don't trust the institutions, or I think that that's what my religious duty is. So we need to think about under what circumstances these rules can actually sustain themselves over time. And I think there's a few things about that. So the first is that we need to be able to have multiple identities at the same time. I'll give you a silly example. When I'm in Europe, I have a chapter defending patriotism. Let me start with that. So I have a chapter defending patriotism. I think that's one of the important things. Why is patriotism important? Because subnational identities are always going to come very naturally to us. We're always going to have the vast majority of citizens who are born into a particular kind of family that has a strong cultural tradition, that has a strong religious or non-religious tradition, some kind of strong moral tradition. And so it'll always be easy for people to say, I'm X kind of person, I'm Y kind of person, and that distinguishes me from my next door neighbor, that distinguishes me from the person a town over, or from the person on the other side of a country. And we need to have respect for that, and we need to allow people to live in accordance with those kinds of subnational identities. That's one of the parts of being in a free society. But we also desperately need to have something that helps mitigate conflicts between them. Something that helps them say, I don't just trust the institutions to keep the peace, I also trust that my neighbor has some amount of goodwill towards me. I also trust that even though on one level we're not the same, on another level we have a commonality which allows us to cooperate. And I think patriotism is uniquely able to do that if it is conceived in the right way. If it's an inclusive patriotism, which is not based on ethnic distinctions, but rather on two dimensions that I argue for in the book. The first is less surprising. It's a civic or constitutional patriotism, which says, for example, that part of what it is to be an American is to believe in certain fundamental aspects of our constitutional order, certain fundamental rights and obligations that we have as citizens, even though we may be aware that our country has never fully lived up to those values. But secondly, I also argue for what I call a kind of cultural patriotism, because most people don't care that much about politics. And I think that there is a kind of logical flaw in constitutional patriotism as a sole basis for patriotism, because actually the constitutions of different countries are quite similar, and the fundamental political values of different liberal democracies are quite similar. But if Australia tomorrow adopted the United States Constitution word for word, none of us would suddenly become Australian patriots. That's just not how it works. And so I think that we should also defend a kind of cultural patriotism, which recognizes that when most people say, I love the United States, what they mean is a special attachment to its kind of sights and sounds and smells and its cultural scripts, which govern how we interact today. Its cities and landscapes, even silly things like its, YouTube or TikTok stars. And that actually is a dynamic and forward-looking and evolving and naturally diverse culture, right? I'm not talking about just sort of going on about the, dresses that people wore as they descended the plank from the Mayflower or something like that. For that too is part of our culture, but really, I think what makes people, gives people a special affection for their country is a love for the culture with which they grew up, which can be dynamic and can be inclusive. Now, to make that work, we need to emphasize that people can have multiple levels of identity at the same time. If you have to choose between being a Christian or Jew or Muslim and an American, if you have to choose between your sexual identity and being an American, if you have to choose between various forms of subnational identity and a national identity, then we're really going to come into bad conflicts, and that's going to create problems. And that's the answer. That's why I started off talking about Europe, but I give European audiences, because I'm always asked, especially in Germany, but not just in Germany, well, you're in favor of patriotism, but what about Europe? What about European identity? Isn't that really what we should do? And my answer is always all of the above, right? If you put French or Italian identity in competition with European identity, I'm pretty sure that the French or Italian identity is going to win.
Yeah.
But if you tell people you can be a proud Bavarian, and you can be a proud Catholic, and you can be a proud German, you can be a proud European, you can be all of those things at the same time, that I think is a realistic vision for a more diverse society. And that helps to give a cultural backing to the institutional framework, right? Because it helps to tell people, look, it's not just that we hate each other and we're really 100% defined by the things that make you and me different. But, I guess there's a police around the corner that's going to, lock me up if I try to coerce you to follow my religion. So I guess I'll desist. That's not going to work for very long. I think you need also a culture of genuine connection between citizens, where we're able to say, hey, you have very different religious beliefs than I do, or very religious, different political beliefs, very different lifestyle, very different whatever. And I might not like that particularly, but there's other things that actually connect us, and there's a minimum amount of respect that we can have for each other. And that, I think, gives us the social preconditions for diverse democracies to actually work.
Yeah, and I love this in part, well, whenever someone is in, sort of this kind of enthusiastic agreement, it totally affirms all of my priors. So that's one of the reasons I love it. But I think it also draws our attention. This last riff draws attention to, I think, why what makes your work distinctive and so important. And there's two things, and would love for you to think aloud on it. One is that I think that liberal scholars generally and liberal thinkers, for all the right reasons, we tend to be occupied with concerns related to government power. But that concern sometimes can then sort of push aside concerns about cultural power. And that can be cultural power from a sort of dominant ethno-religious, dominance, but it can also be a cultural power within a certain industry or a walk of life. And I'm thinking in particular of higher education. There's a particular brand of cultural power that comes within the context of the scholarly elite, right? But also groups, right? That groups and the freedom of association, it's what we celebrate in liberal society. But you're like, I really love Jacob Levy's work on this, on pluralism. And I think I hear echoes of it in your work as well, where it's, yes, we want pluralism, but we want pluralism without romance, right? We have to recognize that groups can also be the source of real challenge, right? And to the point that the way you framed it is people need freedom in both directions. They need freedom from state coercion, but they also need freedom of exit and freedom to exercise agency and autonomy with respect to the groups as well that they're a part of. So I think that's one really important dimension here. Let me pause there, because the other point I want to make is a little longer. So let me just pause there and say, is that your perception? Does your perception match mine, or would you push back that liberals sometimes underestimate and under theorize about power in these non-governmental sources?
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I was quite influenced by this concept of a cage of norms in this. There's just a really powerful description in The Narrow Corridor by Asimov and Robinson about the way that actually for most of human life, the thing that really constrained you in your freedom was your own group, right? But for most of human life, really the most powerful force that told you what you can and can't say, how you can and can't worship, who you can and can't marry, what you can and can't eat, how you can and can't greet somebody. I mean, the most fundamental things really came from those unspoken, unwritten, sometimes written, sometimes explicit, very thick sets of rules to which most humans for the history of the world were subject. And so, we are in many ways products of the 20th century, right? And when you look at the 20th century, it's very easy to focus on tyrannical state power, because the history of the 20th century was, and certainly the history of injustice in the 20th century was to a very large extent, the history of tyrannical state power, from fascism to communism and so on. So it makes it easy to have this one-dimensional way of conceptualizing where the danger lies. But the second danger is just as real. And it makes for difficult institutional design, right? Because we need protections from the state, which ensure that the state does not become so powerful that it becomes tyrannical, that ensures that when somebody is elected, we will still have a chance of throwing them out of office in the next elections, which ensures that the one great value of our political system, collective self-determination, does not run up against the other great value of our political system, individual freedom, which is to say we have to make sure that the majority does not get to tell us how to live within a certain sphere of our life. And all of that is fundamentally important. But it is also fundamentally important that we ensure that when a 20-year-old woman wants to date somebody who perhaps is from a different ethnic or religious community, her parents don't have the ability to threaten her, make that impossible, or to beat her up or to murder her, as happens, including in the United States and in Western Europe at times, right?
Yeah.
And so we need, paradoxically, a state that is constrained enough that it doesn't become tyrannical, but strong enough that it can actually help protect us against the tyranny of our own groups under certain circumstances. And that's not a trivial challenge of institutional design.
Right, exactly. And I think that this is the perfect moment to bring in your park metaphor. So when it's the chapter that I call it the What Good Looks Like chapter in the book, and you describe, you set aside the, we've tried some metaphors that don't really work very well about what the good society looks like, what a liberal, diverse liberal democratic society looks like. Let's junk those and let's instead think about a park. Talk about that, and then I want to push the metaphor with you a little bit, because it's like if we were to really press this metaphor, what's required? What are the conditions under which the park is going to be a great park, and what's required of us as private citizens, what's required of government. So I want to stick with this park metaphor, but first I should let you explain it.
Yeah, the funny thing is that when you think about what an attractive society would look like, especially in the context of immigration and the extent of integration that we should or should not aspire to, everybody seems to come up with culinary metaphors. So, perhaps sociologists are just really into food. And the funny thing about that is that any culinary metaphor implies the cook that's sort of in the background exercising a recipe in a way that I think leads all of those metaphors astray. So one of the ones obviously is the melting pot, which comes from a play, by the way, by Israel Zangwill, premiered in Washington, D.C. in 1905, which I recommend everybody to read because it's easy to sort of make fun of that metaphor. But when you read the play, it comes from a really powerful moral ideal of people whose ancestors murdered each other, deciding to get married despite those obstacles because they want to, not because they're ignorant about the real world conflicts, but because they have this moral vision of overcoming them. It's a very powerful ideal, but it has, I think, at some points in American history been used in too homogenizing a manner, right? It's implied that to become a true American, the new American culture might have spaghetti with meatballs and might have kung pao chicken or something. But if you're Italian, you should be no more likely to eat spaghetti with meatballs. And if you're Chinese American, you should be no more likely to eat kung pao chicken. And if your food is a little bit more sophisticated or tasty than either of those, then you might get fun of, and that's fine, right? There's a sort of idea of a melting pot which is overly homogenizing. So
right.
TV dinners and apple pie or whatever, right? And that obviously is something that I reject because it's too intrusive on individual freedom. There's then a counter metaphor, which was developed in response to it, which became much more influential in academia, continues to be influential there, which is the salad bowl, or sometimes the mosaic. That's the one non-culinary metaphor, so it still implies an artist who's carefully laying out the stones. And that, I think, goes far too far in the direction of, we don't think of the state as a collection of individuals, we think of it as an association of associations. So we're just going to have these different groups and they live peacefully and side by side, and perhaps there's a kind of cultural festival once a year where they can sort of admire each other, but really they have nothing to do with each other. And that, I think, is naive about the social preconditions for the stability of diverse democracies. I think it's naive about the extent to which we'll be able to keep the peace if we have no form of mutual contact and solidarity. And I think it would then be in danger of making people subject to the coercive power of the groups far too much. And so I suggest this sort of third metaphor, which is that of a public park. And what I like about the public park is not only that it has a few logical features which diverse societies share, but for example, you need to have a basic set of rules, and you need to have some way of punishing those that break those rules in extreme ways. But it's that it allows me to say both that we should be free to decide how much time we spend outside of our own groups, and that we can nevertheless have an overall judgment about what is healthy for society, right? So you and I, Emily, if we were in the same city, as sadly we're not, could go after this conversation and sit in a park and say, we're not keep talking about these topics, but some things we still want to hash out, and we're not interested in talking to anybody else who might happen to come and ask us a question or something, right? But we could also, all of us, go to the park and have a picnic, and if some other people come and ask us questions and we start to get to know our other fellow citizens, that would be lovely and that would be great, and we would be up for that, right?
And what I love about that piece of it is that, just to interject here, is that in the park you can have these groups that are very clearly gathering because it's a group, it's a family, or it's a community gathering together that all speak the same language, for example. But there's this porousness between, say, that group and the adjacent group, and they might actually strike up a soccer match or something like that, and all play together, or share stories, or offer ingredients if someone's forgotten something. So there's this is one of the things that I think is so lovely about the park metaphor, is that it allows for a kind of porousness here, and that's part of the magic. And like, one way to ruin the park would be to have these strict dividing lines that, look, your group gets to benefit from the park on Sunday afternoons from 12 to 2, and a different group goes in from 2 to 4. Well, that's like missing the whole point.
I think that's exactly right. And so look, in a park, it's perfectly fine that, if you're going to have in Prospect Park, which is where I slightly took inspiration for this metaphor, you might have a Chinese American family and Puerto Rican American family and an Italian American family all sort of next to each other, and perhaps none of them ever talk to each other, and that's perfectly fine. That's an acceptable choice to make in a park. But there's something more winning about this situation. There's something where we feel like the culture of a park and of a country is healthier if at least the kids start to play, whatever, catch with each other, right? And if perhaps some of the adults have a friendly chat as well. And that, I think, captures the basic attributes of a liberal democracy well, right? There's nothing wrong with somebody who says, I have a very strong religious conviction, and I want to spend most of my life surrounded by people who have the same religious conviction, and I'll be friendly to my coworkers who don't, and so on, but all of my free time is going to be spent within this religious community. Nothing wrong with that. That's one of the freedoms you have in a liberal society. If everybody made that choice, right, if there was no connection at all anymore, no connective tissue between different ethnic and cultural and religious groups within our society, that would have very negative consequences. So you can hold both of those thoughts in your mind at the same time. And that's how I feel about the park as well, right? Wonderful for some groups to go there and say, this is a space in which we can celebrate our culture, our heritage, our whatever it may be, right? Or just our families having a birthday party, we don't want to talk to anybody else. Great. But in a park that's thriving, you'll also sometimes see people forging those new connections.
Yeah, love it. I love it. And so, well, one more question before we turn it over to a Q&A with the people who have joined us. So you invite us at one point in the book to imagine the national elections of 2052, right? And you lay out for us what good looks like there, right? And it isn't about, this or that party wins or not. It's not about that. But what is the character of that election? One scenario is going to be really bad for the great experiment. And another scenario says, yeah, that means that we're continuing to really support the success of the great experiment. Talk through what good looks like as we think through, the next 30 years of what our politics should be looking like if the great experiment is thriving?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that part of the book, because it's something that's very important to me. So look, I'm really struck by the fact that today, when I look at the states, we just can't agree on anything, right? Liberals in the partisan sense and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans really don't agree on anything, except for one set of really far-reaching, ambitious social theories that are, long-term projections about the future, which actually, in my mind, happen to be wrong and happen to be dangerous. And there's two fundamental ideas which have started to be challenged a little bit in some circles, but are still really very, very mainstream. And the first is, as the United States Census Bureau would have it, that by around 2045, or perhaps 2048, perhaps 2042, America will be majority minority. The so-called people of color will, for the first time, be in a majority, white people will be in a minority. And that will have some very fundamental cultural, social, and political consequences. And then the second related theory is that of a rising democratic majority, which is to say the idea that since white voters tend to favor the Republican Party, and since non-white voters tend to favor the Democratic Party, you can sort of fast forward with demographic developments, and by 2052, Democrats will basically be winning all of these elections on the basis of appealing to the non-white voter demographic. Now, I think that both of those ideas are empirically wrong, and I think that both of those are morally really, really concerning. So let's start with the political piece that you asked me about, but then I want to say something a little bit broader about the social and cultural piece, the overall way we think about the country. So demographically, that is a description that is terrible, right? In the current state, I have no hesitation for voting for the Democratic Party over the Republican Party. I have some strong criticisms of the Democratic Party that don't always make me popular on the left. But if I'm faced with a choice between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I personally won't hesitate about who to vote for. That doesn't mean that I think a vision of a country in which in 2052 you have these two ethnic super blocs fight it out against each other is an appealing one. I don't want to live in a country in which I can walk down the street and look at the color of your skin and know who you're voting for. And by the way, I would then have to vote for Republican for the Republican Party, which I'm not sure I want to do, right? So none of this is appealing. It wouldn't be appealing, by the way, to have a permanent majority for one country in any case, because any country that has that has deep problems of corruption and so on and so forth. We need an alternation in the government, right? So the vision of a society that I would want is one in which our political system has become much more racially integrated, in which Republicans actually seriously try to pursue a working class coalition across ethnicity, and in which Democrats seriously try to regain victory in those states in which Barack Obama secured his 2008 election, including Ohio and Iowa and Indiana, actually, and other places, right? So, and here the good news is that I think there's clear instances of that happening. The main reason why Donald Trump was competitive in the 2020 election is that he significantly increased his share of the vote among every non-white demographic, including African Americans, Asian Americans, and particularly Latinos. The main reason why Joe Biden wound up being the legitimately elected president of the United States is that relative to Hillary Clinton in 2016, he significantly increased his share of the vote among white voters. And we've seen this trend continue. So in some recent polls, Latinos actually favor the Republican Party over the Democratic Party. And we saw a special election about 9 days ago, I believe, in a constituency in Texas, which was 85% Hispanic, in which the Republican candidate won. So these ideas that demography is destiny are wrong. But I want to go a step further than that even, because it has become very fashionable to analyze American society in terms of whites versus people of color. And I don't want to deny that there are certain forms of racism that all kinds of non-white groups will experience. And there may even be certain kinds of advantages or privileges that people will experience on the color of the basis of their skin. Now, actually, according to these projections, somebody who has Middle Eastern appearance is white, and somebody who has, all Spanish conquistador ancestors, but whose parents and grandparents lived in Mexico is a person of color. And it's not clear to me that even that form of description of society, who's likely to have to feel treatment by the police, well, it's not clear to me that it's the immigrant from Mexico, all of whose ancestors come from Spain, as opposed to the refugee from Afghanistan, right? So even on that dimension, our current census categories don't really make sense. But in a more fundamental way, I think it's just a mistake to think of American society as white versus people of color like that. The place of Asian Americans in America is much more complicated than that. The place of Latinos, many of whom consider themselves white, many of whom have significant European ancestry, is much more complicated than that. There's important splits between African Americans and more recent immigrants from Africa, which I think complicate that. To think that in some obvious metaphysical way, the child of European royalty on one side of the family and Indian Brahmins on the other side of the family, who is born and raised in an affluent suburb of the United States and goes to an elite private school, but that person somehow is metaphysically part of the same category as a descendant of slaves, all of whose ancestors were mistreated in terrible ways, and who's growing up in a private neighborhood in Washington, D.C. or in New York. That just is a religious belief to me, and not a religious belief that I'm particularly well inclined towards. And so I think that we really should resist those overly simplifying descriptions of our social reality, both because they obscure what's actually happening in the country in important respects, and because they imply a set of visions for our future, which we should work very, very hard to ensure that they don't become reality.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to turn it around to the people who joined us. Michael, I'm going to invite you back in, and I'm sure you've been gathering some good questions.
Yes, very much so. Thank you, Emily, and thank you both for a wonderful conversation. And thank you also to our members of the audience who have submitted a number of interesting questions for Yascha. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of those, but we will get to as many of them as we can. And since you've just been speaking about how the future should look, let me ask you about your optimism about the future of the great experiment. You write that both supporters and opponents of diverse democracy are often pessimistic about its future, but you offer an optimism which I think is really refreshing. Can you tell us why supporters of the great experiment should reject pessimism, and why developments on the ground in many of today's diverse democracies are actually more positive than many observers realize?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, look, I think that there's a really paradoxical thing to how we tend to think about this topic. So most people start from a kind of naive optimism. So they start from the sort of like, well, how hard can it be to build these diverse democracies? How hard can it be not to hate your neighbor and not to be a bigot or a racist? This should be straightforward. And then they look at reality and they see, we haven't talked that much in this conversation about the traditional modes of failure of diverse society, all the different terrible ways in which they can go wrong, which I spend a lot of time on in the book. They see that, and they see some of the very real challenges we have today, including racism, discrimination, as well as failures of integration. And they say, well, if we're failing so miserably at a simple task, how can we have any hope in the future? This is just all not going to work. Now, what I try to do in the book is sort of the opposite direction, which is to say, we need to start with an appreciation of how difficult this damn thing is. And we talked about some of the reasons for that difficulty in our conversation, an account of what makes it so hard to build diverse democracies. But then I think we can look back at the present state of the big liberal democracies in the world and the ways in which they've evolved over the last decades, and realize, A, that the glass is half full, that we shouldn't be complacent, but we should also recognize that compared to the terrible civil wars and genocides and conflicts and forms of domination that we've had in the history of the world, today's societies are actually remarkably inclusive, tolerant, and egalitarian. And secondly, that we have been making very real progress. So let me give you a couple of very straightforward examples of that. In 1960, 5% of the US population thought that it was morally acceptable for a white and an African American to intermarry. 5% thought it was morally acceptable. Now about 5% of the US population think that it's morally unacceptable. So it is a shift from nearly universal rejection of the moral acceptability of this to a nearly universal embrace of it. And we know that this is not just people shifting what they tell pollsters, it's a real sociological change, because the number of mixed race babies in the United States has actually gone up from about 1 in 33 to about 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 in just the last few decades. So we see it's a real change in behavior as well. On immigration, there's a weird skepticism of parts of the right and the far right especially, which essentially says, look, perhaps immigration has worked in the States in the past, but that was in part because it's the right kind of immigrants. Today's immigrants from Mexico and El Salvador and Vietnam and Kenya and so on, they're not going to succeed because there's something supposedly inferior about them, perhaps culturally, perhaps even genetically, right? You hear various forms of that argument. From the left, you have rightly a rejection of that attribution of blame, but you often have a deep skepticism about immigration as well that comes in the form of saying, look, our societies are so discriminatory and so racist and so unjust that whereas immigrants 100 years ago from Italy and Ireland could succeed and could integrate, could become part of the mainstream, could rise in socioeconomic ranks, those immigrants today just don't have the same opportunities. So it's all going pretty badly wrong. The best studies simply reject that pessimism. They show that the first generation often struggles, especially if it's people who come from less educated countries as adults. They may find it difficult to acquire the language. They're unlikely to earn as much as the average of the population. But the children, the grandchildren also enjoy real deep integration and very rapid socioeconomic progress. In fact, they're rising the ranks through education, they're rising the ranks in terms of wages at about the same speed as Italian and Irish immigrants did a century ago, which I think really nicely gives the lie to both of those forms of pessimism.
So as wonderful as it is to hear about those optimistic trends, let me bring you back to a challenge. Our viewers ask, you write that in a liberal democracy, the state should protect the rights of individuals. And of course, one and an important one among those rights is freedom of speech. But some thinkers take the view that certain instances or types of speech can amount to violence. How can we reconcile that interpretation of speech with the view that the state ought to protect fundamental rights, such as freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, I think it can't, and that's one of the reasons why we have to reject that interpretation. It's perfectly fine for people to advertise the traumatic consequences of certain forms of speech as they see them. It's perfectly fine for citizens to exhort each other not to engage in certain forms of speech. And obviously, every citizen is free to use language that even I may consider hyperbolic. In doing that, that itself is part of the freedom of speech. But certainly, when it comes to our institutions, we need to make a very clear distinction between physical violence, which must be energetically punished, and offensive language, things that we may think we know are objectively wrong, other forms of speech, many of which really are noxious, many of which I personally find disturbing and disgusting, but which have to be allowed in a free society. Not because we think that every utterance has value, but because one of the key things that the history of liberal institutions has taught us is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that we want to start from the understanding that each citizen is fundamentally of equal moral worth. And both of those things make it impossible for us to entrust any one individual or any one institution with the decision as to what speech is acceptable and what speech is unacceptable. And so, yes, there's lots of noxious speech. If you want to say, saying this to me is as bad as violence, I think that's hyperbole, but you're free to say that. But we need to make very, very sure that whereas if you go and strike your next door neighbor, hopefully the police will show up and deal with that in the appropriate ways. If you tell your neighbor that he or she is an asshole, or even if you insult them in more disgusting ways, that is not going to land you in jail.
I think we have time for one more quick question. And since we've established that it's okay to geek out a little bit, let me prompt you to respond to this question about the role of the state in liberalism. You unpack philosophical liberalism in a way that provides an important role for the state in the liberal project, especially when it comes to protecting individual rights. But some liberal thinkers have argued for a stateless form of liberalism. As you think about it, can the liberal project work without a state, or is the state necessary for liberalism and human flourishing?
So I do think that it's important not to think about freedom in the state as a zero-sum game. Now, absolutely, there is a very real danger of a state becoming tyrannical. And as I was saying earlier, the 20th century has plenty of particularly striking examples of that, but so, of course, do societies before and after the 20th century. And so I think as liberals, we always will be well advised to keep our primary eye on the state's tendency to become tyrannical, right? I mean, a liberal who takes the eye off of that is really making, I think, a grave moral and strategic mistake. At the same time, it's important to also note that there are ways in which a strong state are a precondition for liberty. The state effectively policing crime is not in conflict with liberty. It is a precondition for us being able to have liberty in any kind of meaningful sense. If I have to be worried about being mugged or murdered the moment I step outside my door, I don't get much enjoyment out of my liberal rights, even if at some theoretical level I might have them. And so I think we should not have a presumption that a strong state is in every respect in conflict with liberty. In certain respects, absolutely. But we have to think about each topic and each question and decide, in this respect, do we want a state that's strong, or do we want a state that really stays out of this question? In lots of areas, the answer is going to be we want the state to stay out. But in some areas, it's going to have to be that it steps in. Now, I think, especially when it comes from freedom from your own group, there's going to be a lot of hard cases there, right? And a lot of the time, there's going to be a real trade-off between, well, on the one hand, the state is starting to look into how families treat their kids, and we should, for very good reason, be queasy about that. On the other hand, there is the, families threatening their adult children with physical violence for living their own lives, and that's very bad as well. But my answer to that is always that no philosophical concept or theory is ever going to make a real-life hard case, a real-life difficult trade-off go away. That's just not in the power of philosophical concepts. The way to judge philosophical concepts is whether they are able to elucidate the nature of a trade-off in the right way and make us pay attention to the right things. And here I think that my conception of liberalism helps us to see why these cases are difficult, and helps us pay attention to the costs of both a state that is overly intrusive into groups and families and so on, but also helps us see the cost of a state which is so weak that it leaves individuals at the mercy of the cage of norms.
Thank you so much for that, Yascha. I think it's my job to close this out here. I just have enjoyed this conversation so much, and I hesitate to bring it to an end, but let me do it this way. I'm going to come back to Michael's initial question, which is, what gives you hope? The thought that went through my head is what gives me hope about the success of the great experiment is that we've got a lot more thoughtful people thoughtful liberals, I would say on the left of center liberals, classical liberals, right of center liberals, right, who are paying really close attention, that there is this sort of like sense that maybe for a time we all thought we could take it for granted, the liberal project, but now we know we can't. And the thought and care that you put into your work, the thought and care that you put into assembling the community at Persuasion and the thought leaders that you feature at Persuasion, that gives me hope. And I'm so delighted that you are doing the work that you're doing, and that you are associated with IHS as well, because I think that this is the most important work that any of us can be doing. So I thank you for that. I thank you all for joining us today. And if you haven't read it so far, do pick up and read The Great Experiment from Yascha Mounk. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Emily, to you and all the great work that the Institute does. It's really an inspiration, and I too take a lot of solace from the community of people who are seriously thinking about this topic, and you do a lot to sustain that.
Thanks, Yascha.